Good evening, everyone. It is January 27, 2013. I'm Rene Ritchie, and tonight we're talking Apple earnings, Vine porn, Macworld, and more. This is the iMore Show. It's been an exciting week, especially for a month that is typically slow for Apple news. First of all, I am going to yet again revisit that quagmire that is skeuomorphism. This is the follow-up that would not die. So last week I went over a lot of things that I felt and thought about skeuomorphism, and it turned into a blog post. I had trouble making my point in a podcast, so I whipped up Photoshop and I decided to kind of put some pictures to go with the sounds. Now, skeuomorphism, I want to explain again. Skeuomorphism is when you take a real-world object and you make a digital version. For example, the clock app on the iPad. It looks like the Swiss rail clock with hands that go tick-tock. And you don't need that in a digital world, but it's something that we can relate to from the physical world. So it makes it more approachable, more discoverable, more friendly. Now, a lot of other people use the term generically and, maybe wrongly from a design point of view to cover everything that is heavily designed or skinned or themed, like Game Center in iOS. Game Center is not skeuomorphic. It is themed, but it's often lumped in there. And there's this thought that if Apple were to wipe skeuomorphism off the face of the earth, if they were to do a Scarlet Witch and just say no more skeuomorphs, that everything would be fine and dandy in iOS land. So what I did is I took a bunch of apps. I took a bunch of regular apps like Settings and Mail and Safari, and I took a bunch of more heavily themed and designed apps like Find My Friends and iBooks and the aforementioned Game Center. And I did versions of them in all a unified, almost iOS 6 Maps style, elegant aluminium theme, which I named after Johnny Ives and his very correct pronunciation of aluminum. Just to show what it would look like if everything was absolutely consistent and not heavily textured or themed or gradiented in iOS. Now, some people loved it and some people hated it. It just went to prove that, once again, people have very different feelings on this. But beyond feelings, there are usability issues. For example, if you take the Game Center About Me page, and you just look at it in a standard iOS interface, something like Contacts, you no longer know what app you're in. If you launch Game Center, whether you like it or not, you know that you're in Game Center. There's no question. And when you have tons of apps with tons of similar screens, it's easy to not know which app you're in, especially if you unlock your phone after not using it in a while. So one of the reasons that iOS apps all look distinct is that it's easy to tell what app you're in. And Apple always intended the iPhone to be a screen into a digital world. They wanted to make the iPhone and iPad almost featureless, completely a giant screen with very little chrome or border or hardware around it, so that all you saw was that screen, which could then be filled up with any number of apps, wondrous or terrible. Now, maybe in some cases it's gone too far and it is too heavily textured and it is too over-designed. And that will be an opinion case for everybody. Maybe the bookcase, like Brian, I'm going to mispronounce your last name, apologize. Brian Chesky in the chat room is saying, maybe the bookshelf in iBooks is fine and it looks great to you, but maybe the stitched leather in Find My Friends or the green felt in Game Center is too much. And I won't argue that. That's a matter of individual opinion. But in some ways, it does make the apps distinct, and it also means that something that could be dry and database-driven and boring, frankly, gets a little bit of visual pizzazz to make up for the lack of pizzazz in the actual app content itself. Siski, he's telling me, the English pronunciation. Thank you, Brian. So I put a link to that in the chat room. I put a link to it in the show notes. So take a look at that, and you can see what iOS would look like if it was made absolutely bare bones and unified and consistent, and you can see whether you like it. And Louis Mantilla from Pacific Helm did the blog post version of a Rebound, and he made a version that went even a step further, and he said the discussion should be about Chrome or no Chrome, meaning no interface at all. So he made a black version of Safari, almost like Twitterific 5 blackout version, which looks very good, and I linked to that. And Craig Hockenberry from the Icon Factory had some really concise points about the ability to differentiate apps quickly at a glance, and I linked to that as well, along with a Macworld article by Dave Wiskus, a blog post by John Gruber, and a blog post by my co-host from Iterate, Mark Edwards. All very, very smart stuff, and a tweet from Sebastian DeWitt, very well known, formerly iOS, now Double Twist designer. So all of that is in there, and check it out and let me know what you think. Where do you fall on the skeuomorphic versus digital authenticity, from the flat design to the very heavily skinned and themed design? Because I'd like to know. I'm going to go back and say one last time that I still think that this is not the area I want Apple spending their time on. I want Apple to focus on making iOS 7 and iCloud next generation. I want them to leapfrog all the stuff we're talking about now and do stuff like push notifications that actually let us do actions in the notifications that bring data to us no matter where we are in the app, or headless apps that let things work in the background without taking up interface. There's all sorts of areas that I think Apple can spend their time on, and hopefully this is given the attention it's due, but proportionately. If we all get iOS 6 with a makeover in June, I think we'll be rightfully disappointed. Next subject, Macworld iWorld 2013. Tomorrow, if the freezing rain in Toronto does not stop me, I will be jetting off to San Francisco, where hopefully it is warmer than the minus 20 Celsius weather we're enduring here in Montreal. And I will be attending Macworld iWorld. Actually, before that, I'm hoping to visit the Twit Cottage live on Tuesday, so I can do Macworld with all my co-hosts in the same room for a change, and that would be lovely. And then Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, I will be at the Macworld iWorld Expo. I'll be going, Leanna Lofty, who usually covers Macworld with me, has just had baby number 2, the lovely Lucy Dene, so she will not be able to attend, but I'm bringing Martin, I am bringing Safe Solvent from Twitter, Martin Reich, with me, and he is a fantastic photographer and videographer. We want to keep the level that you guys have come to expect from our content very, very high. So, Steve Streza is saying it's a lovely 60+ degrees in San Francisco. Bless you. Looking very forward to it. So we're going to be at Macworld all week. If you guys are there, if anyone is there, please do come up and say hello. We'd love to meet you. And we'll be doing our best to bring you with us. Our goal for Macworld in every event is to make you feel like you were there with us. So look for a lot of photojournals, a lot of videos, and a lot of behind-the-scenes content. And if you want the whole story, the stuff that's not fit for print, you can follow me at Rene Ritchie on Twitter, or you can follow Martin at Safe Solvent, and we'll be doing a lot of social sharing in between the actual events. I'm also going to be on a panel on Thursday hosted by Lex Friedman of Macworld, with John Gruber from Daring Fireball, Paul Kafisis from Rogue Amoeba, and Matthew Panzerino from The Next Web. We'll be discussing the future of Apple and advanced pro-level users, and whether Apple is still interested in their business. And we will bring you full reports on all of that stuff and more. So before I delve into Apple's earnings, I'm going to talk a little bit about something that has always been an issue in the App Store, but rises and falls in profile depending on what's going on in the circumstances. And I'm talking about porn. And this has recently been in the attention, has gotten a lot of media attention again, because the 500 pixel app was removed from the App Store. It had been available in the App Store, and Apple removed it over concerns of pornography. Now, 500 Pixels is a professional photographer site, and it has what they consider to be artistic nudes in there. And Apple believed they crossed the line, and that users had complained to Apple that they crossed the line into pornography. And there's that famous cliche that I don't know what porn is, but I know it when I see it. Hot on the heels of that, Twitter launched their new 6-second concise video sharing service called Vine. They actually purchased it and now launched it under the Twitter umbrella. And Vine lets you record, they're not animated GIFs, but they look like animated GIFs. Very short video segments. And immediately, of course, people put up porn ads, they put up penis shots, and they did everything that unfettered internet access and content uploads allow people to do. And that has now gotten a lot of media attention. And I don't think anyone is shocked by this, because this is what happens anytime there is user-generated content. People put up pictures of food, they put up videos of their kids, they put up all sorts of stuff, and among that is adult content. And if it was audio, there'd be audio porn, and if there was text, there'd be porn stories. It's just something that is part and parcel of user-generated content. Now, that creates a bit of a problem for Apple. Apple has always had two different developer platforms, and Steve Jobs has said this on the stage, that they have the App Store, which is heavily curated and is intended for a family audience. And there's a range within that from, kiddie apps to apps that are more for adults, that are the equivalent of an R-rated movie, perhaps. But it is not meant for porn. Now, there's also the web. Web development on Apple is very well supported. Web apps on iOS are incredibly well supported. Not only do you have Safari, one of the best HTML5 browsers ever, you have web.app, which lets you take those web pages and put them as web apps on your home screen with an icon and everything. And you have UI WebView, which lets you embed everything except for the Nitro rendering engine. You get a slower JavaScript engine, but all of that web content in your apps. And it's the latter that's causing the problem, because if you have App Store apps on one side, heavily curated, and web apps on the other side, which aren't curated at all, the problem arises when these two things blur in the middle and you have apps that are pulling web content, because then the app gets curated, but it's almost impossible to curate the content. And this has happened several times. There have been apps that were uploaded to Apple containing innocent pictures, and a developer flipped a switch on a server and suddenly they were filled with porn. You've had apps like Chat Roulette. You've had video sharing apps that quickly got filled with pornographic content that Apple later pulled down. It happens every once in a while. It got attention again because of 500 pixels. It might get attention again because of Vine, but it's something that keeps occurring. Now, Apple said early on that the App Store is something that they will never be able to predict in advance, that they're going to come across, like they made these broad guidelines for what they thought were the major areas that they would have to take care of on the App Store, but they're always finding new things that they never thought about before. For example, there was a problem with political satire. You weren't allowed to make fun of public figures, but an app got rejected that was from a well-known political cartoonist. And Apple adjusted the rules and moved forwards. And this is something that they have not dealt with yet. It's been 4 odd years of App Store, 4.5 going on 5 years, and eventually they're going to have to deal with this. And I want to preface this by saying that we have this, not all of us, but some people believe that the world should be a completely safe place. And that's a delusion. The world is not safe, whether it was thousands of years ago and there were mammoths and saber-toothed tigers, or whether it's today and there are buses and cars and all sorts of things. The world itself is a dangerous place. There are all sorts of man versus nature, man versus himself problems that cause danger on a daily basis. Now, the web is no different. There is all sorts of wonderful and terrible content on the web that you can come across either intentionally or unintentionally. And it is impossible to prevent that. I remember, and I don't know if this was an urban myth in my area, but I remember when I was young, there was an accident and a child drowned in a river in a local forest. And that's absolutely a terrible occurrence. But the city started talking about putting the river in a pipe so that no one would ever drown it again. And it had to be pointed out to them the absolute damage to the environment that that would cause, because a river is not meant to be in a pipe. Every bubble can break. You cannot protect people from everything, nor should you, because that is a recipe for stagnation, entropy, and disaster. We are meant to face challenges and grow as a people and as individual people all the time. So all you can do is mitigate. You can mitigate against the risk. And in my opinion, all Apple should do is require apps that contain user-generated content to have the same regulation that apps that allow unfettered web access, and that is a warning up to 18 plus that you can see this kinds of content if you manage to find it. Now, I know some people hate that because they believe that it creates fear and it leads people not to use their app, but that's fine. People who are scared by that warning maybe shouldn't be using that app. When they are no longer afraid of it, or when they approach it and understand what it means, then they can click through and they'll be happy to use the app. But at least either way, they'll be informed. There will be apps that allow user-generated content, just like there are apps that allow unfettered web access. And yes, it's ridiculous that 1Password has to have this warning because there's an embedded web browser to insert your passwords into. But the reality is you could come across this kind of content, and as G.I. Joe said, knowing is half the battle. So I would like Apple to just issue that as a policy. You know, far be it for me to be one of those Apple should people, but I think this would rectify the issue, mean that we don't have to deal with these stories anymore. Adults can get along living adult lives, and people who shouldn't be seeing things they shouldn't see at least get a warning, and their parents get a warning, and responsible people get a warning when you download them. And again, I know 500 Pixels didn't want that rating because they believed that their service didn't warrant it and they wanted a lower rating. But you know what? Your service allows for that content, so take your warning and move along. We're being invaded by Crackberry Live. For those of you not familiar with it, Crackberry.com has a new headquarters in Toronto anticipating the BlackBerry 10 launch. They are all together in one house. Insert all your Lord of the Flies jokes now. We're not sure who's going to be the sole survivor, literally or figuratively, but they are working hard on everything BlackBerry 10. So they're in the chat room. Welcome, guys. Simon Sage, Adam Zeiss, Chris Parsons. I saw Crackberry Kevin Mitchelluk himself earlier. I'll bring you up to date on the iPhone news while you're still waiting for your platform to launch. So that was our big porn story this week. Next up, Apple earnings. And I went on a bit of a rant about this last week based on how the media was handling the build-up to Apple earnings, specifically how noted and respected news outlets were publishing stories that could be seen as damaging to Apple's stock price, and doing it in a way that was very suspicious and very confusing. So what ended up happening? Well, there's two sides to that story, and they're two very contrasted and very interesting sides. Now, Verizon released their results first. Verizon sold 9.8 million smartphones last quarter, 6.2 million of which were iPhones. If you do the math, that's about 3 out of 5 smartphones bought on Verizon were iPhones. So the iPhone 5, iPhone 4S, and iPhone 4 together outsold not only any specific Android, BlackBerry, or Windows phone, but all of them put together. Insert your Apple is doomed joke there. After Apple announced their earnings, and I'm just going to do this from smallest to biggest instead of chronologically, AT&T announced their last quarter earnings, and they sold 10.2 million smartphones, 8.6 million of which were iPhones. That's between 8 out of 10 and 9 out of 10 smartphones that AT&T sold were iPhones. So again, iPhone 5, iPhone 4S, iPhone 4 outsold not only any individual Android, BlackBerry, or Windows phone, but all of them together by a margin that is so large as to probably appear comical. Insert Apple is doomed joke there, and insert me saying I wish I was as doomed as Apple at this point. So that's America, you could say. You know, America is different. American people are predisposed to buy Apple or predisposed to buy expensive smartphones. And by the way, as much as people say they want bigger phones, they want 4.5, 5-inch, 6-inch phones, Apple doesn't sell a phone bigger than 4 inches. And almost 9 out of 10 people on AT&T and almost 6 out of 10 people on Verizon chose a small 4-inch or smaller phone that ran iOS to every single phone that was bigger by a huge whopping margin. So everything that we hear online doesn't always reflect the larger population. And you can say that either people don't like the bigger phones, like smaller phones better, or that they like iOS so much they're willing to put up with a smaller phone in order to have iOS, even if they'd prefer a larger phone if they had their druthers. But that still has to be factored into Apple's decision-making process, and that's something that we'll return to shortly. So Apple's results. Apple announced their results for last quarter. 47.8 million iPhones, 22.9 million iPads, 12.7 million iPods, 4.1 million Macs, and $57 billion in revenue. And we'll just break that down super quickly. So again, there were a bunch of hugely positive articles about Samsung a couple weeks ago when they sold their 100 millionth Galaxy class phone, Galaxy S2, Galaxy S3. 100 million phones. Great news. Really happy for Samsung. They make good product. Congratulations. Apple sold almost 50 million iPhones in one quarter, compared to Samsung selling 100 million Galaxy phones ever over the course of years. So we'll keep that filed aside for later. The iPad is continuing to grow. There are still no real other tablet competitors, and that can change at any time. But for now, it's the de facto mainstream tablet. iPods are continuing to go down. Year over year, we're seeing decline in iPods, and that includes declines in the iPod Touch, which is interesting because the iPod Touch accounts, Apple says, for about 50% of iPod sales, and those continue to go down. But as they go down, iPhone continues to rise, iPod Touch continues to rise. And this is one of the things that I like the best about Apple. And I've said this before, they're one of the few companies that don't mistake their product for their business. There are a lot of companies that are petrified in fear about disturbing or disrupting their existing business. Microsoft is a great example. They have killed a lot of great projects, things like the Courier, things like alternative phones and operating systems, because they're afraid that it would damage Windows or Office products. And here you have Apple, which was making a mint with iPods and annihilated it with the iPhone. And the iPod Touch was on a rise, and they're annihilating that with the iPad because they would rather replace their products than have a competitor do it. And Tim Cook actually mentions that later on, so we'll get back to that as well. Macs were down. That might be because the iPad is eclipsing the Mac, or it might be because Apple's having trouble making Macs. Making Macs. We'll look at that in a second as well. So here are a few interesting things. Tim Cook addressed the larger screen iPhone rumors. And he pointed to Apple's results, and he said that, Apple spent a lot of time and effort thinking about what's the ideal smartphone size, and they've decided that they still want a phone that's used in one hand. And for them, 4 inches is about as big as you can go in order for it still to be used with one handed ease of use. And their results, again, 9 out of 10 phones on AT&T, 6 out of 10 phones on Verizon. People pick the 4-inch or smaller phone over all larger screen phones, including 5-inch and bigger Android phones. So it's hard to fault Apple for that line of reasoning. There still might come a time when Apple looks at the numbers and decides that they might get to 9.5 out of 10 or 7 or 8 out of 10 on Verizon if they also include a larger phone. They'll keep their current market, but they'll expand to an even greater market. Steve Streza in the chat room was pointing out that what Apple says has nothing to do with what they do in the future, and that's absolutely true. They said no one wants video on their iPod. They said no one wants smaller tablets. No one wants to read books anymore, and they announced the iPod with video. They announced the iPad mini. They announced iBooks. So this should only be taken as a representative of what Apple wants customers and competitors to think now, and in no way to be mistaken for what they may be thinking about the future. Tim Cook also addressed what we spoke about last week, which were the rumors about Apple cutting orders. And he basically said that people shouldn't take that kind of stuff at face value, that they should first look into the reasons why these rumors might be passed along. And he also said that because Apple deals with so many suppliers and they change their criteria a lot for what kinds of components they need, that any one data point is not sufficient to project sales for Apple going forward, even in the short term. So he was basically saying don't listen to bullshit rumors, even if they're published in journals of record, which I think was a good statement to make. He's also talked about cannibalization, because we've seen the iPhone cannibalize the iPod. We've seen the iPad cannibalize the Mac. And now we've seen the iPad mini probably cannibalizing the full-sized iPad. And Tim Cook's position continues to be the same, that he would rather Apple cannibalize their own products than someone else do it. Apple is very good at walking in and making a mainstream version of a product and eating up a market like they did with MP3 players and are currently doing with tablets. They don't want that to happen to them, which is why they're continually bringing new products to the market. So he also reiterated what he said several times before, that he believes there will be cannibalization from the iPad and the iPad mini now towards their Mac line, but there'll be far more cannibalization of the PC market. He believes that they will hurt Windows business way more than they'll hurt Mac business, and that there could be a halo effect where just like people bought an iPod and then bought a Mac, or bought an iPhone and then bought a Mac, or some other product, that it's a gateway into the App Store, it's a gateway into the Apple ecosystem, and it's something that can increase their sales going forward. He announced almost offhandedly that the iPhone 5 will go on LTE on 36 more carriers starting next week, which leads many to believe that iOS 5.1, which hit beta 5 yesterday, will be announced along with those extra carriers to provide that support. And since beta 5 looks to all intents and purposes like a gold master candidate, suggests that it may be very imminent, so make of that as you will. He was asked again about Apple televisions and the Apple TV, and he smacked that down like someone playing basketball when you're trash talking their mother, which is interesting given how often that kind of question is asked. And he just repeated the lines, pulling the strings, intensely interested. They think that Apple has something to contribute. So when and if they see a go-to-market strategy, which hasn't changed since, JStar is saying 6.1. Golden Master, thank you. The chat room is so much smarter than me. When and if Apple sees a go-to-market, which hasn't changed since Steve Jobs famously pointed out all the problems, including regionalized fiefdoms of cable and satellite operators and the different countries and the ownership issues and the content issues, then maybe Apple will, announce something on those lines, but it's probably not short-term. He also pointed out the value that the iPhone makes for carriers, that people who buy iPhones tend to use a lot of services, and those are the services that carriers want to sell, which is why carriers are willing to pay a premium to carry the iPhone on their network, and why people are willing to pay a premium to have and use an iPhone. So while there are cheaper devices on the market, so far these haven't helped carriers. A lot of carriers really didn't want to agree to Apple's terms, and they tried to use WebOS, or they tried to use Android, or they tried to use something else to attract and retain customers to the level that the iPhone was originally on AT&T, and it just did not work. Nothing worked. Droid didn't work. Evo didn't work. Palm Pre didn't work. So they've had to, from Verizon to Sprint, and now in the near future T-Mobile, start offering the iPhone. So Apple believes that's their value proposition, and that's probably something to think about when you talk about Apple making less expensive products. So that's a quick overview of everything that Tim Cook went through, and we've got full notes on the conference call and a bunch of breakout articles for you, and I will put the link to that in the chat room and in the show notes as well, so you can peruse it at your leisure. Following this, Tim Cook had a town hall meeting, which is something that he is wont to do. Steve Jobs used to have them as well. He had some pretty famous and fiery town hall meetings, including the famous, "What is MobileMe supposed to do? Well, then why in the expletive redacted doesn't it do that?" And the famous rant about how Google stabbed them in the back with Android. So these things are interesting to see how Apple is talking to their own. This leaked out thanks to Mark Gurman, the ace reporter from 9 to 5 Mac. And basically, Tim Cook addressed employee perks, things that they're going to be doing to thank their staff going forward. He addressed the retail stores, supply chain sales, Google's Android, the opportunities in China. I apologize. I've got to ban somebody in the chat room. There we go. Banned. Ban hammer. All right. So One of the interesting things about Android is that he pointed out the value proposition of iPhone over Android. This is what Mark Gurman wrote. Cook discussed iOS's integrated, reliable experience versus Android's fragmentation with a plethora of devices. Cook also noted that Android is about market share with its range of devices and low pricing, while iPhone and iPad products are about experience, top hardware and software quality, and most importantly, actual usage by customers. Um, and that's, I mean, that's the talking points. That's the boilerplate again about Android. But to me, there's no phone hardware or software that's perfect. I've used every platform. Every platform has its good points and its bad points. And depending on your personality, you will be more or less annoyed by any one of those problems and more or less delighted by every one of those strong points. Uh, Android's choice of devices is a huge selling point for some people because they can get a device with a keyboard or with a giant screen or with a Facebook button. You know, if you want to cha-cha, they can get all these different things. Um, so while yes, it does cause pain, it does cause fragmentation, that's neither good and bad in and of itself. That depends on the user. And Google, to their credit, has been iterating Android really, really quickly. And yes, Android still does suck for user interface, and Google knows that, and they did Project Butter to try and fix it. And rumor has it they're working on fixing the underlying problems with frequent redraws and compositing and everything else to try to fix these things. But they're working on it, and it's not a good strategy to count on your opponent always being stupid or always being behind. Usually, if you want to train to beat something, you want to assume it is bigger, stronger, faster, and better than you. You want to beat an opponent on their best day, not on their worst day. So I don't think that Apple's strategy should rely on Android being a worse user experience or being more fragmented. It should depend on Android being an A+ level competitor and on making the iPhone so good that even that wouldn't be enough. Because to leave it up to Google, to say that we're counting on Google screwing up, is outside Apple's control. And Apple doesn't usually like things outside their control. Apple has no control about how great Android is or how sucky Android is. They only have control about how great or how sucky iOS is. So that's where their time and energy has to be placed. But the good thing is, I think Tim Cook knows this. Tim Cook is very passionate about everything at Apple, from the staircases in the Apple Store to the build quality on MacBooks and iPads. He talks about it in the way that someone who really understands it talks about it. And that just means Apple has to execute. They have to execute on the software and services that are better than Google Now and better than Google Voice Search and better than Google's online offerings on their best day. That's how Apple stays ahead, and that's how Apple offers the best quality devices that delight users, which is what Apple says their goal is. Apple says their goal is not to make money, not to get market share, but to make products that absolutely delight their users. And I mean, we can make fun of that and say it's disingenuous or that it's a bunch of crap, but Cook pointed out, they could slap the Apple logo on anything. They could have Apple t-shirts and hats and mugs in every Apple store. They could be churning out tons of low value crap that people would buy just because it's Apple, and they don't do that. They're very careful what they put their brand onto and what they put their company's attention to. So again, hopefully this is well understood and it is being well handled by Apple. So that being said, what are we looking forward to in 2013? Where do we think Apple is going to put their attention? And there have been some good quality rumors lately. There was the analyst, and I'm going to mess up his name. It's Chiming Kuo, I think, who's usually has pretty good predictions. I don't like trusting analysts because I'm not their customer. Their customer are investors, and their job is to make money for investors and not to provide accurate information about Apple. So I'm very loath to believe them. But what he put out was reasonable. And iLounge, Jeremy Horowitz, who's got a very good track record with supply chain sources on Apple products, he put out some stuff. Now, what he was hearing about is an iPhone 5S codenamed N51 coming as early as July, perhaps with an upgraded 13 megapixel camera. Ming Chi Kuo, yeah, thank you, Saina Saidi. iPad 5 J72 coming October with a thinner, lighter iPad mini casing. iPad mini 2 J85 also coming in October with the same design, but perhaps a Retina display. A cheaper iPhone on the drawing board, mostly for China Mobile, just because it's in an area where there is a limit to Apple's ability to sell high-end phones, and they might want to start addressing emerging markets. Also, a larger iPhone, which may or may not uh, make it to market. Now, coincidentally, absolutely no little birdies were hurt in the making of these posts. Earlier in the week, I put up a bunch of speculative stuff about where we could see Apple going in the near future. The first one was a less expensive iPad. And I've talked about this before. And it's important to understand with a less expensive iPad, when Apple says they don't make cheap stuff, that is absolutely true. Apple never made a netbook. They never made a junky iPod. What they do is they make less expensive versions of their product. In the case of the Mac Mini, for example, or the iPod Shuffle, they removed the screen and that lowered costs. It's still a premium product. It's still beautifully manufactured, but it has less things so they can sell it cheaply. With the iPad Mini and the iPod Nano, originally Mini, they reduced the size and the capabilities so that, well, the iPad Mini not really as much except if you count the Retina screen, but they reduced what it could do, leaving the same functionality and the size, and were thus able to offer it less expensively. Again, not cheaper. There is nothing about an iPad Mini that is cheap. It is fantastically produced, expertly manufactured, fantastic hardware, same software as the big iPad. It is just less expensive to produce. And the same thing is true of the iPod Nano. So Apple could theoretically do the same thing with the iPhone. They could go back to a plastic casing, which they did with the iPhone 3G and the iPhone 3GS. They could even go back down to a non-retina display. They could not use in-cell for the panel. There's all sorts of things they could do to make a less expensive version of the iPhone. And some people will say Apple already has a free iPhone. They have a free iPhone 4 on Verizon, Sprint, and on AT&T. But that is on contract. That is not free. That is you agreeing to pay back the carrier over time. That phone actually costs $450 odd, which is expensive for someone who only earns a couple $1,000s a year, which is what the reality of emerging markets are. So if Apple could knock that down to $350 or even cheaper for a less expensive iPhone off contract, unlocked, just buy it. You walk in the store, give them their money, you get the phone, service is your responsibility, then that is a huge market for Apple. I don't think it's likely that Apple will engage that market until they believe they've sold all the premium iPhones that they can sell. When everyone who is willing to pay $450, $550, $650, $750, $850 for an iPhone has given them their money, or there is such a huge amount of people like China Mobile coming online who would only buy a less expensive iPhone, then it makes sense for Apple to do it. So that's one of the articles, and again, I will put that in the chat room and in the show notes. Next up, we have the 5-inch iPhone. Now, I find it hard when people speak in abstract, which is why I did that post about a skeuomorphic free iPhone. I like to sort of break it down and look at it, because you can say Apple wouldn't or would do this, but what are the realities? What are the technological constraints? How could it be done? That, I think, is very interesting, because opinions are easy when they're not informed. When opinions are informed, when you have the information in front of you and you can make judgments on it, then I think it makes a much more interesting conversation. So I'm putting that in the chat room and the show notes too. But I started thinking, what could Apple do for a 5-inch iPhone? Now, obviously, you know, the Droid DNA, for example, it's called the Butterfly by HTC and other countries. It has a very large, I think, 5-inch screen with a 1080p. That's 1920 by 1080 pixel screen at a phone size, not even a phablet size, but a phone size. So there is technology coming that allows for larger and higher density displays. So what could Apple do? Now, Apple could take the existing iPhone, the iPhone 5, and just stretch the screen out bigger. have the same 1136 by 640 display and literally make it bigger. So every pixel on it is bigger. The interesting thing about that is if you take that display and you stretch it to 5 inches, you take it from 326 pixels per inch to 264 pixels per inch. And that's exactly the same density as the current iPad Retina display, the iPad 3 and the iPad 4. And that's interesting because when Apple made the iPad mini, they took the iPad density and switched it to the iPhone density. So taking the iPhone density and switching it to the iPad density still means Apple only has to produce 2 densities of panels. And when you're running off panels on these giant machines, the same density screens are much cheaper to produce. So whether that is a factor or not, it's something to consider. It's something that Apple has done in the past. So Shamu Muji is saying it makes no sense going backwards in pixel density. Pixel density and what Apple calls Retina is density at distance. That's why a 1080p television looks fine at 10 feet away, even if it's 60 or 80 inches. If you hold an iPad Retina on your lap, it's just as dense as holding an iPhone at your elbow distance. So a bigger phone presumably would be held slightly further away, and that would mitigate some of the loss of density. Also, an iPad, if you've looked at an iPad 3 or 4, it's not that much less dense. So there's wiggle room within that marketing term. That's all Retina is a marketing term. It would also mean that developers don't have to do anything. Their apps would just work. Everything that works on the iPhone 5 would also work on the theoretical 5-inch iPhone. Video games, videos, anything like that would look perfect. The only drawback is that interface elements might look too big. They might even look ridiculously big. The iPad mini, everything got smaller, and some people complained that the interface got too small for them to use on the iPad mini. The opposite problem would happen with an iPhone stretched, is that every button would get a percentage bigger, and that might be good for people who don't have great eyesight, but for other people it might look almost comical. So it's something to keep in mind. The next thing Apple could do is go to 5 inches at 3x. When they went from the original iPhone to the iPhone 4, they pixel doubled everything. So where you had 1 pixel before, you suddenly had 4 pixels. But what that meant is that old apps still worked. They weren't as sharp as new apps, but for every single pixel on that app, they just used 4 pixels on the new display, and everything stayed perfectly on the grid. There was no anti-aliasing, and developers could take their time to update. So if you go to at 3x, then you go from 1136 by 640, the current resolution, to 1704 by 960. And at that at that size, at 5 inches, you have about 391 pixels per inch. So that's sharper even than the current iPhone Retina display. And it's a bit of a middle ground approach. Developers, pixel-perfect developers who care deeply about every single point and of their apps will have to make at 3x assets. Like when Apple announced the iPhone 4, I remember right after the announcement, a bunch of developers, including Mark Edwards from Iterate, came running out going, I've got 900 pixels I have to redo. Sorry, 900 pictures I have to redo. And that'll happen again. But the apps right now will look good enough that they can take their time, make higher density versions, and the universe will go on spinning just as it should. Now, another option, because that still isn't 1080p. If you have 960 pixels vertically, it's still not 1080p, is to go to at 4x. Which could sound ludicrous to some people. The Droid DNA, again, is 1080p. So if you go to 4x, that would be 2272 by 1280, 522 pixels per inch. That's almost insane. Right now, Apple can't make a Retina display in an iPad mini because there's not enough LED to light it at that density. There's not enough graphics to drive it, and there's not enough battery to power all that in a package that small. So you'd need considerable new technology, things like IGZO panels, things like the new, more powerful LEDs, things like a new, more advanced, more power efficient Apple chipset, advances in battery chemistry maybe to make that work. And you'd still have pixel quadruple now, all the graphics and stuff, but it's a possibility, and it's something that might occur in the future. Now, some people have said they just want an iPad mini with a phone, or they just want the iPad mini display, shrunk down to 5 inches to use as a phone. And that looks like a big square in your hand, basically. You would get compatibility. Every iPad app would suddenly run on the iPhone. Existing iPhone apps would be letterbox, and they'd look pretty much the way they do on the iPhone 5. But the interface would be so small as to be unusable. If you think it's small on the iPad mini now, it would be so tiny that the touch target, which is 44 points on iOS, would be, you really literally have to sandpaper down your fingers in Steve Jobs parlance. So I don't think that's likely. One of the last things Apple could do is 5 inches at an arbitrary or a standardized pixel count. By standardized, I mean 1080p. And I don't think Apple would ever do that because it would just be chaos for developers. There's no reason for them to have preserved the existing pixel ratio for this long to just switch to some random number, even if it is a standard now. And by the same token, if you just pixel triple or pixel quadruple the existing iPhone display, you don't get any more real estate. Things are just bigger. There's no more pixels. You can shrink things down further and they will be even sharper, so you can show more of a web page or put more stuff on a screen, but you're not really getting any more apps on the screen. For example, app icons, they would just be more detailed. So if Apple wanted to take the existing iPhone display and move it to 5 inches, it would go to 1420 by 800, and you would get, for example, 5 apps across, and you'd get 6.5 apps down, not including the dock. But again, you'd have a lot of problems for developers. And Apple would not like apps to fall off the grid. What that means is if you go from 1 to 4 pixels, every pixel is still perfectly aligned. If you go from 1 to some arbitrary number, you start having real fuzziness because not all the pixels are actually being rendered anymore. So that becomes a problem. The same basic thing applies to 4.5 or 4.8 inches. So it would you wouldn't lose as much density, but you wouldn't gain as much size. So would Apple ever do this? Again, it comes down to addressable market. Apple went to 4 inches. People said Apple would never change it. Well, they did. They went to 4 inches. And Apple has steadily increased things about the screen every couple of years. With the iPhone 4, they went to Retina display. They doubled the pixels. 2 years later, with iPhone 5, they went to 16 by 9, and they actually increased the amount of pixels on the screen. So do we believe Apple will never, not ever, change the screen again? In 10 years, we'll have the same screen we have today? That's hard to believe. What's easier to believe is that Apple takes a step-by-step approach so that developers have one thing to change and not multiple things to change. And there's one new technology to be added. So if we look at Apple going to the Retina display with the iPhone 4, with the iPhone 4S, they went a little bit better with it. With the iPhone 5, they went to 16 by 9 and an in-cell display. So it improves steadily year after year. Maybe in another year or two, they'll take another step and they will increase the size or do something else. If they believe that increasing the size will only let them sell the same amount of iPhones, then there's very little reason to do it. It just fragments their line and they don't gain anything from it. If they believe that everyone who bought an iPhone would keep buying it and they'd add additional people buying iPhones with a larger screen, then it starts making sense for them to do it. So anyway, again, the article is in the chat room. It is in the show notes. Take a look at it. Take a look at the mock-ups. I did a bunch of concept pictures of what each version would look like and how the pixel densities compare, so you can check that out. The iPad 5, I did an article earlier in the week asking if you would like an iPhone 5 that looks and feels like an iPad mini. So we'll talk about both of those really quickly. The iPad mini doesn't have a Retina display because Apple had to choose one of 3 things: 10-hour battery life, thin and light casing, or a Retina display. They could only have 2 out of 3 of those things. If they put a Retina display in, the battery life would go down or the thickness and heaviness would go up. So they chose not to have a Retina display. If they want to put a Retina display in, they'll need new panel technology, IGZO panels or whatever. They'll need longer battery life, more efficient processors. They will need certain technology to be in place for them to do it. By the same token, the iPad 3 and 4 are as thick and heavy as they are, thicker and heavier than the iPad 2, because they need to power that Retina display. They need the LEDs. I believe it uses double the LEDs of the iPad 2. It has a bigger battery, has a more powerful graphics processor in order to make that Retina panel work. So in order to make the case as thin and light as an iPad mini, they would have to go with better LEDs that go back to one LED instead of two. They would have to have battery that can power it for 10 hours, either through more efficient LED, more efficient screen technology, more efficient processor, or better chemistry. And as Steve Strezza points out in the chat room, they would also have to do it keeping pretty reasonable margins. They'd have to do it being able to make as much money off the stuff today as they made out of it previously. And I'll get back to my small rant on margins in a second. So that's what to look for. If Apple can't do those things by this year, then you probably won't be as happy with the next generation iPhone and iPad and iPad mini as you otherwise would be. If they can do these things, if the technology is in place, then you'll probably get an iPad mini with a Retina display and a large iPad that has the same thinness and lightness relatively as an iPad mini. And then it becomes really interesting. Do you want an iPad? It becomes really 9.7 inches versus 7.9 inches. And the size, not the overall package or the display quality, starts to matter. So that's basically it for Apple device rumors. I still believe, again, that iOS 7 and iCloud are far more critical for Apple than new hardware this year. We're approaching a point where the hardware is good enough for most people, but when you see what competitors are doing with online services and software features, then I think that points to the direction that Apple needs to go. So, there was also a rumor of 128 gigabyte iOS devices because iOS 6.1 now contains references to 128 gigabytes. And the thing with that is, again, unless you want to add size and weight, you have to use double density NAND flash, which was too expensive last year for Apple to use. But pretty much every 2 years, Apple doubles the amount of memory. They went from 16 to 32, 32 to 64 with the 4S. So with the 5S, will they go to 128? With the iPad, with the iPod Touch, can they finally put the iPod Classic out to pasture? Could they make a crazy $99 version with 256 gigabytes? It all depends on the price of the NAND flash memory and what margins they can maintain with doing it. Jay Friedman, what about OS 10.9? Apple is working on OS 10.9 too. Last year they did a developer preview in February. This year we'll see the schedule, but there will be Apple has said they're going to yearly OS 10 updates. So there'll be an OS 10.9, which I still hope they call Sabertooth because it sounds cool, sometime this year. And Apple tends to do software now at WWDC, so we'll probably see more of it, if not in February or March, then certainly at WWDC. And if Apple really is thinking about moving the iPhone to July, then we'll have to see an iOS 7 SDK event earlier than WWDC so people have enough time to work with it. So back to Apple and their stocks. We have now had earnings reports. We have now had a lot of information from Apple. And after all of that, Apple stock tanked. It went down $50 almost immediately. Apple lost more money than most of their competitors are worth, which is incredibly, it is stupefyingly crazy. And we've been joking around about Apple is doomed rumors. I even called last week's show Apple is doomed again. But when you look at the price to earnings ratio of Apple, which is one of the most profitable companies in the world, sometimes the most profitable company in the world, a company that makes as much money as companies that enjoy oligopoly control over fossil fuel resources, it's stupefying to me that their price earning ratio is so low compared to Amazon, which never has and maybe never will make money. And quite frankly, that makes me think that we as a people are doomed far more than Apple. Now, I understand all the arguments that these things are based on future earnings potential and that people think Apple won't have the same margins in the future or the earnings in the future or that growth has slowed. Growth has to slow. Anyone with an ounce of intelligence understands that the rate of growth Apple was experiencing cannot be sustained by the amount of money in the known universe. If you're growing at that faster rate, eventually people will no longer have enough money to buy your stock. That growth has to slow. But anyone, I believe, looking at the fundamentals of Apple as a company, of where they're headed, their direction, what they produce, what they have historically produced over the last era, to be so myopic about it really is stupefying to me. Now, that's not to say people aren't making a fortune off shorting Apple stock or of doing all these things I don't understand, like putting options on Apple at lower prices. It really is witchcraft and gambling to me. I don't understand it at all. But I have to report on it. And it makes me worry more about us as a people than I worry about Apple as a company. Apple will be just fine. Apple made tons of money when they had almost no share of the computer market. Apple has never had a huge share of the phone market. Nokia and RIM were dominant, incredibly dominant players, and now Android, which isn't Google. Google doesn't make a lot of money on Android. Right now, that's Samsung. When I say Android, I mean Samsung is making the money. Not even the money. They're enjoying the share. And a lot of very cheap Android devices in China are enjoying the share. Apple is still making almost all the money. So Apple is going to cry themselves to sleep in money and gold stuffed pillows over this. I just think that it is bad for Apple employees who have stock options and people who really do want to invest in Apple based on the merits of the company, because they have to put up with all this nonsense. But these are the very definition of first world problems. So I'm not going to worry about it much either. And we probably won't report on it much more either until the next quarter, because it's only really news when it is at critical junctures like this. So that is my pre-Macworld rant. I do not believe there will be a show next Sunday because I will be on an airplane flying home from Macworld. But I will have all my podcast gear with me in San Francisco. So hopefully we will do one or more shows live from Macworld. And I want to thank everyone here for joining us. The chat room is always fantastic. If you haven't already, please do join us live. Do contribute your comments, your wisdom, and your insight in the chat room. And if you can't make it, then you can watch us on YouTube, youtube.com/iMore video, or you can subscribe to us on iTunes and get either the audio version or the video version of the show. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, please do leave a review, please do leave a rating. It encourages more people to find the show, and we really enjoy spending time with you. Thank you to everybody in the chat room. I'm going to run and edit this show and then hope, above all hope, that the freezing rain in Toronto does not prevent my departure. And Steve Streza in the chat room, I will find you in San Francisco and buy you the beverages of your choice just as soon as possible.